For me, I see AI as a major disruptive technology. It doesn't mean it's disruption for bad necessarily, just that it is rolling interpreting for sure in a lot of ways.
And welcome to Slator Pod. Today on the podcast, we welcome Katharine Allen and Dr. Bill Rivers. So Katharine is the Director of Language Industry Learning at Boost Lingo, the world-renowned language interpreting technology company. And Bill is the principal at WP Rivers and Associates, and he's leading language access and language advocacy projects for a lot of clients. So they're both founding members of the Interpreting Safe AI Task Force, which we're going to be talking about today. So hi, Katharine and Bill, and thanks so much for joining today.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So maybe just first, tell us a bit more about your professional background and what inspired you to join the Interpreting Safe AI Task Force, maybe starting with Katharine.
Oh, I've been in the field for so long. I actually came into it straight as a community interpreter with no training and background, eventually did get my master's in conference interpreting. I think for this podcast purpose, probably the most important background I have is the 10 years I spent with Interpret America, where we advocated for the profession. And we also really started observing technology trends in interpreting. So I have a practitioner background, but I've also spent a lot of time looking at the field and the structure of the field and how technology impacts we've had all these waves of technological disruption. And then in my role at Boost Lingo, I definitely, am part of the AI discussions inside the company. So working hard to stay on top of things.
What languages were you interpreting into?
The most classic California American languages, Spanish, English.
All right. Very good. Bill, what about your background and the Safe AI?
Yeah, so I started almost 40 years ago as a Russian English-Russian conference interpreter, also with no training whatsoever. I did that. I was a freelancer for about 7 years. Sometimes it was a side hustle. Sometimes it was my main gig. Ended up getting a PhD in Russian, and I've been an academic researcher, an administrator. I was CTO of a small company, a defense contractor. I was a leader in the U.S. intelligence community for 7 years. But for the last 12 years, I've been a lobbyist, and the last 4 years running my own lobbying and consulting firm. I've also been founding chair of ASTM F43, which is the U.S. Standards Committee on Language Services and Products. And I got into this in part because of for some reason, I like to start organizations, especially nonprofits, which doesn't have a big, really good exit plan. But I was asked, I wanted to be part of this. And when we had an organizing meeting, I apparently left the room briefly and came back and was chair. So
you got to be careful, Bill.
Yeah,
that can happen. And I take it, so Katharine, you're based in California, and Bill, you're based in DC, or?
Yeah, just outside of DC in suburban Maryland, yeah.
Out of your respective backgrounds, maybe start with the kind of 30,000-foot question, like in interpreting, training, advocacy, shape your perspectives generally on AI in language services. We used to call it machine translation, machine interpreting. Now it's just AI. But maybe, Katharine, like 30,000-foot AI in language services.
What I love about my background is that I've kind of been all over the profession at a lot of different levels. So I am a practitioner, but I am also a trainer, and I've also been a leader in professional associations and, been involved inside of the sort of the large oversight of what the industry as a whole. I actually find that there aren't really that many people who understand both. And I'm not saying that in any kind of braggy way, but just like very few people sort of embed themselves both as like, I was doing RSI during COVID, and, I get to go to the Gala conference and see what's happening in Europe and see what's happening, in like the business end and the industry end of the field. And so for me, I see AI as, a major disruptive technology. It doesn't mean it's disruption for bad necessarily, just that it is going to roll. It is rolling interpreting for sure in a lot of ways. I think you see an interpreting workforce that's doing its best to try and get on board with it, but you have a lot of lag with just sort of use of these tools and understanding of the tools and, how can we use them? And I see a business sort of industry sell side that really wants to be able to say, we've got it. We don't really need people that much, or we're going to have human in the loop, but look at this great fast tool that just does what people do, which also is false. Right. So there's sort of a false narrative on both sides, like, oh my goodness, AI is very scary to, or oh no, it's not going to impact at all to, hey, we've got a tool that can really roll out and do, I think, more than people think it can do at this point. So I just see it as we're in that time, like remote interpreting and mobile applications. It's just going to change the way we do work, and we're gonna move into very hybrid era, I think.
Yeah, and like Catherine, I've done a lot of different things. In the aughts, I had operational responsibility for several thousand linguists in the National Language Service Corps. Um, I've done a lot of work with state municipal governments on developing language access needs assessments, language access plans and policies, and nuts and bolts of how to provide language access. And that's part of the regulatory perspective that I'll probably talk a little bit about later. Um, did some work as a researcher in computational linguistics back, again, 20 years ago, when we could see that you could use couple ASR, MT, and NLG, which we now call, speech to text, MT, and text to speech, automated speech recognition, natural language generation. You could chain these together to get to that very elusive, universal translator, right? That, we first saw it in Star Trek in the 1960s. And having a background in engineering as well as linguistics, I can make a fairly clear-eyed assessment of the technology and where it is and where it's going. And like Catherine said, just as when statistical MT dropped, which is almost 25 years ago, and I was at the HCA meeting right after that happened, and the sky was falling, right? And the fellow named Yosechi, who we may know, got up and said, translators aren't going to be replaced by technology. They'll be replaced by translators who learn how to use technology. And that it's become kind of a trope or a cliche, but it's actually true. And to the degree that the translation localization industry has just absorbed all of these technologies, integrated them into workflows, created new use cases and whole new verticals with them, I think we're going to see analogous things happening, maybe not in the same exact way with interpreting, but we're still going to need humans involved. And you know, whether it drives an increase in demand for human interpreting is as yet unclear, but certainly that, statistical MT eventually drove a increased demand for humans, because suddenly all this content was accessible. And then the purchasers, the clients were saying, well, wait, okay, is this really fit for purpose? Now we have to have a human post edit, or we have to have a human involved in the loop, and whatever that looks like. So, there's a hype curve that we've talked about. The idea that this ChatGPT 3 launched in March of last year and was going to, make my waffles in the morning and restore my hairline and do all these miraculous things. Right. And now 18 months on, we can say, well, it has some practical applications. It has some real limitations, and it's still, as a technology, still very much in a nascent stage. We have to see how it matures and where it actually can help. And at the same time, we still have in the United States, we have 75 million people who speak a language other than English at home. At least 25 million are linguistically isolated, the Census Bureau's term for limited English proficient, and they still need language access. And there are, inherent limitations as to what the technology can do around that. And so where that fit, what's fit for purpose and what's the right blend of technology and human involvement is very much still evolving.
Catherine, have you seen areas where you feel it's working already, meaning speech to speech, meaning AI interpreting, whatever we call it? We had tested one of the technologies at SlatorCon Remote last week, right? So did you see a use case already where it's working, or?
Well, I think the clear use case in interpreting is ironically at the top, of the field in the conference and interpreting an event space, and where you have events where there's like one to many, right? That when you're using a speech to speech and you have presentations and structured speech and speech that's not like, I'm in a hospital and I'm in my most dire human dialogue communication. That's where it's definitely making inroads. It's where it's being sold. Depending on which company you talk to, it's not eating into their human interpreting, and others say it is, right? In terms of their what's being sold. So yeah, you definitely see that. And I think that the a deeper issue is this issue of what accurate means, right? So when you say, oh, this is like in Spanish, it's 97% accurate. And in, maybe when you drop down into a language that has less data on it, it's, 60% accurate. But the accuracy we're talking about is linguistic equivalency of words and phrases and sentences. We're not actually talking about the full scope of meaning that humans engage in when they communicate. So, if just in this conversation, the tone, if I'm upset, if I'm happy, if I'm laughing, if I'm sarcastic, even just at that basic level, it fails pretty fast, in human dialogue. So you have this very strong use case in the one to many, especially when there's not risk, especially when people can go, oh, well, that sounded weird. That's kind of clunky. Oh, look, like, yes, it's accurate, but I had to kind of think through what did they mean by that sort of overly literal production. That's fine. And so, yes, it's really powerful. It's a huge expansion of multilingual access in places that we haven't had, right? I mean, you really see that where you can apply that. But you're not going to see it, in the EU in sensitive meetings as the only thing, right? Yet, just because the AI can't parse for layered communication. It can't parse when an interpreter needs to go, oh, I need to actually synthesize this and put it out this way. It doesn't do that yet. So this is where I think probably the biggest challenge I see is just people really want it to be equivalent. And it's not, it's two different things. It's just two different ways of achieving a communication, and they're not the same. It doesn't mean that they both have deep uses. They do, but they're not the same, right?
Let's explore the Safe AI task force, capital letters, all caps. So, like, what specific concerns, you outlined some now, that this kind of perceived equivalence about AI and interpreting led to the creation of the Safe AI task force. And I think you engaged a bunch of stakeholders from healthcare, legal, tech to collaborate on this.
I can start just by saying that, at least in the States, we love technology, right? We're very it's built into our culture, has been for a long time, and we like easy solutions and so on. Not really good at nuance, and so you have that. And you also have the fact that even though language access is a civil rights requirement in the United States, deriving from the Fifth and 14th Amendments, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities. There's all these legal bases for it. It's an unfunded mandate. And that's because in civil rights law in the US, you don't get paid extra by the federal government for not discriminating, for doing what you're supposed to do. You don't get bonus points. You don't get extra money for, following the law. Number one. Number two, language access here is tremendously complicated. And, I live in a county with more than 250 languages spoken in the school system. It is virtually impossible to provide language access to every LEP child, every child who doesn't speak English, with a live human. There are maybe 20 Georgian speaking kids scattered across 5 or 6 schools. You're not going to hire, a Georgian interpreter if you could even find one, right? And so the AI offers this promise, and we were concerned that people would be adopting it without thinking it through. Much as, machine translation, especially the free versions of machine translation, they look very attractive to government entities in particular, or to, quasi-public entities. I mean, healthcare, even if it's private sector, is so heavily regulated in the States. It's very attractive if it's free. And if you don't have the capability, the organic capability in your organization to review the content as it comes out, you don't know if it's made a mistake. So just before ChatGPT 3 launched, and I think 2.5 or 2 is still out, had come out, there was a sentence on a state health department website in Spanish: La vacuna no se necesita. The vaccine is not necessary. Perfectly good Spanish sentence. The English original was: the vaccine is not mandatory. A human translator taking a certification exam in the US or in, one of the EU countries would fail on that if they were going, English Spanish, because that changes the meaning. But they didn't even realize it, the Virginia Department of Health. It led to a major civil rights complaint. And the point was it wasn't that machine translation was being used. That wasn't the issue. The issue was it was not being reviewed. It was not being quality controlled, and stuff was going out that was wrong. and that can have consequences. In SlaterCon, if the AI messes something up and it didn't get everything right, and there were some really clunky moments, it's not necessarily consequential, right? As much as we love SlaterCon, and we want the information, um, and I think that's what Catherine's talking about, like your business conferences, your quarterly regional sales call for big multinational companies, et cetera. That isn't necessarily consequential the same way that an interaction in an emergency room would be over a 911 or 099 or whatever the equivalent is in the country. And getting things right, even though we know humans don't always get things right.
So, Bill, I'm gonna step in and put you back around to the question of like, why did we form Safe AI? Because you've given a wonderful framing of like what we were concerned about.
Take it away.
I just think Bill's just given a really good difference of the nuance, right? When a lot of us in the field who'd lived through the onset of remote interpreting, saw Safe AI coming in. Saw the AI coming in. For me, at least, the immediate reaction was we never, as a field, put up any response to that technology. To this day, we do not have best practices. We do not have research, actually not very much on like, how is it different if you receive your healthcare over remote versus if you receive it in person? And this was all in person, like the field as a whole. And so you had a lot of disparate reaction. You had people who thought it was the worst thing that ever happened. You had people who thought it was the best thing. And in the meantime, the technology rolled out, the companies found a way to sell it effectively, and it just took over, right? For better or worse. And honestly, it's greatly expanded language access, and it actually makes compliance inside the US possible. But it still escapes most of the regulation in the way the on-site does not. Like this technology is given a pass in a way. I'm still waiting to see at some point whether someone's going to go, hey, wait a minute, all of these many, many, many interpreters, many who aren't even in the US, don't truly have the same qualifications, et cetera, right? So I think part of our response was, we'd like to be at the table for this one. This is going to come in and roll it the same way. So we would like to be able to have a voice, and we don't want it to be folded under translation and localization, because it really is a separate, part of the field. And so it was sort of 11 people that got together and said, we would like to, stand up an effort, get some initial data, reach out to as many stakeholders as we possibly can. And we did reach out, through a survey and through social media, and we had about 600 people respond. I think we had 11 stakeholder groups, and Bill, you can help me out on which ones they were. But the initial impetus was, we want to be able to come up and say, hey, we want this technology is going to come in. It's going to do great good. It has a potential to do great harm. We'd like to put some basic consumer protection on it, the same way you would with your car. And that's basically the goal. It's just that there is some kind of guideline and some guidance and some kind of guardrails around, what criteria do we have to apply these? And when is it all human? When is it all AI? When is it more likely going to be some kind of hybrid effort?
No, interesting. So you're saying basically, remote, that was kind of missed. And so you wanted to make sure that, the industry or you as stakeholders, you're not missing this one, because this is huge.
Right.
This is, it's going to basically shape the next five years. I want to jump to policymakers. So Bill, you're in DC, you're lobbying. What are your interactions like with the policymakers when you're advocating for, basically legislation there, or, the use of it, the fair use of it, ethical use of it, safety? What are your conversations like? Is it getting drowned by the giant AI conversation, or is there some nuance to be found?
We've kind of pushed our way into the bigger AI conversation, and that takes that larger conversation around the use of AI in society, by the government, in healthcare, has really just started in the States. We've seen applications of AI for things like imaging, for radiology imaging and pathology imaging, where it works really well in certain applications, and others it doesn't. And part of the challenge is the people developing these applications don't necessarily know why. It's not always a question of having enough data or of training data or what have you. In some cases, working with more accuracy than the trained medical personnel, and certainly faster. And that's just one example, right? But then there are other applications. A lot of concern of the use of AI for, um, approving or denying healthcare procedures, um, insurance, car insurance and things like that. And the question, and the open question is this really being done equitably? Because there are significant inherent biases in the data set. I mean, if you're operating on the internet, if the whole of the open internet, right, is essentially your data set. And I'm oversimplifying, I know, for your large language models. There are going to be large chunks of that data that have all sorts of quirks and biases. Like social media tends to exaggerate um, more extreme or provocative positions on whatever side of the political question, and that's just because that's how that algorithm works, and so that looks more salient. And it's been a real challenge for the large language model developers to work away from that. Then there's work that Slater has done itself. I think Sema Albarino presented last year about the fact that something like 80% of the data, I'm probably misquoting her paper that she presented at ATA in 2023. The vast majority of the data are in English. The second biggest chunk are in computer languages, HTML, Java, whatever, and then a very small percentage in the world's other 1,000 or so languages that are represented online. And that poses challenges when we get into this. Has posed challenges for MT for a long time, and those have been carried over in many ways into the large language models when they're applied for interpreting and translating. We see weird artifacts when you're dealing with, Turkic languages or German dependent clauses because the verb's in the wrong place, and the sentence is built backwards and it doesn't go right to left. It doesn't go in the same, and the AI and MT at least used to build in that direction. But when the head of the phrase is at the other end, then it has to go back and fix it. Um, third person singular possessive pronouns in French are a mess. Sans cesse, because they take the number and gender from the noun that they're accompanying, not from the pronoun. So you get little effects like that have been well known, well documented, and turn out to be really tricky to fix. And so, okay, when we talk about the application of AI, and I don't go down into the weeds, but I'm trying to do it to exemplify that there's a lot of nuance there. And now we have a new administration that signaled it is not interested in regulating much of anything, and that is a political stance, which means it lets the market regulate things. And that can be inherently powerful, but it also leaves the chance that something goes terribly wrong and medical errors introduced by AI, whether through an interpreting platform or some other platform, and then who pays for it. And I think that's going to be, frankly, a forcing function in the US, because in the EU, it's consumer protection. There's already laws around that. In the US, it's a civil rights basis, which is less, in some ways, less stringent. In some ways, it gives the government much more power to pursue investigations, but it doesn't necessarily get at like the root cause of an error, right? It's not as strong a regulatory mechanism in some ways. And I think, and I just think the new administration they're going to change some of this. At present, the current administration treats AI as essentially equivalent to MT, and the use of AI without human oversight, intervention, whatever, is generally not considered compliant with civil rights obligations. That may change, I'm not sure.
So maybe I ask you both. I mean, how do you see the new administration changing or not changing this? I mean, generally the language access, framework. I mean, is this mostly for us U.S. based people, citizens, what have you? Can a Trump administration change this fundamentally, or is this Congress, or will they, or what are some early signs? And then, I mean, generally for the language access framework, and then for the AI component, which you're probably much more liberal about. I mean, liberal in the free sense of the word.
Yeah, in terms of the language access, they may try, but there's, we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act isn't going anywhere. Obamacare, I don't think is going anywhere. It's far too popular. It's vastly expanded healthcare coverage. People like having healthcare coverage. The offices of civil rights aren't going anywhere. And the previous Trump administration did enforce language access. Usually,
They
it's
tinkered
even
it,
hard.
right? I
They
mean, they
tinkered with
tinkered
the
with the code and the
regulation.
language,
Yeah,
right? They tinkered with it. They weakened where they could, but they couldn't
And they
they still
couldn't.
enforce
Why?
it.
Like, because yeah, it's civil rights. It's basically almost constitutional, or is it like, yeah?
It derives from the Constitution, from the Fifth and 14th Amendments, which Fifth Amendment requires due process. 14th Amendment requires equal treatment before the law. And that's the fundamental basis of the Civil Rights Act, that no person shall be discriminated against on the basis of their, in this case, their national origin. And thanks to a 1974 Supreme Court case, language is considered part of national origin. And that was a unanimous court case, Lau versus Nichols, 1974, 9-0. So they tinkered with the regulation at the end of the last administration. They just around the margins, but didn't remove the requirements for language access, the fundamental requirements. And they continued enforcement throughout the first Trump administration, as the George W. Bush administration did. They may do less enforcement, but that's really too early to say. And the senior civil servants are all staying in place.
for now, right?
For now.
I'm much, much more of a layperson than Bill on this, but I did experience sort of on the operational level what it was like to be working with hospitals and different, clients around, okay, what are they doing in it for them? So they tinkered around the edges. They took down the Spanish version of the major government website that covers all this. They even, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, they put up a little sign saying that they were not enforcing as strongly. They actually put it on, if I'm not misremembering, for our lep.gov. But for me, so to answer your question, why can't it just get wiped out? Because you would have to overturn the law. And it is such a foundational, fundamental law that even with the Republican control of all three houses, like they don't have very strong control of the Congress, right? It's just a tiny razor edge margin. So in the weeds, in that sense, it's actually just, you can't just go in and change it. And yes, they've said we're going to have this Doge, but it's actually an extra legal entity, which is probably going to get challenged in court immediately because it doesn't exist, right? And so like all these things they make a lot of headlines and they come in and they're scared. I'm not, depending on what you think, you either love it or you hate it, but it's not just immediately applicable, right? And the other part I wanted to say for the broader audience is that when it comes to AI and how it's going to move into interpreting in these sensitive spaces, I actually think that we are going to see I think we're going to see a lot of harm before we get to the balance, because the US is actually the most regulated place in the world. That does require legally that you provide meaningful access to services. And there's a pretty robust definition of what meaningful means. And meaningful goes way beyond providing a simple linguistic equivalent of a translation or an interpretation, right? It means you really have to give people equitable access the same way as if you spoke English, right? Those laws don't really exist anywhere else in the world. So you already see AI going out into healthcare, like say in the UK. Where it's like the National Health Institute is already contracted with big companies to put in replacement speech-to-speech AI across many languages for direct medical care. You're already seeing people, there's actually a case, as our colleague Mila likes to point out, you have a case where a young girl died because of misuse of AI with a food allergy. I think we're just going to see a lot of turbulence and chaos, because on the flip side of that, the possibility that you could go into these regulated spaces and have an iPad that has 250 languages that like allow people to communicate where they can't communicate at all is amazing, right? So I just think it's going to be the wild, wild west, as we say in the US, for a while, right? We're going to see the good, the bad. There's going to be harm, and people are going to fight about it. And eventually we're going to, just as we have with these other technologies, or we're trying to, you find that kind of steady application of where it belongs. So if that makes sense.
Quick follow-up on the I mean, you could call it marginalized language, you could call it languages of lesser diffusion. Have you looked at this at all in terms of the Safe AI project? And if so, what were some of the results? I mean, Bill mentioned 200 languages spoken in just his district. So have you looked into this?
SafeAI hasn't commissioned research on that specifically, but I think we're collectively well aware of it. You have a language like Rohingya. There are a lot of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar now in the upper Midwest, in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota. And I think in Minnesota, it's now the number 3 language. It's like always Spanish, then Spanish is almost always the number 1 language everywhere, and then Somali. But Rohingya doesn't have a written form. People aren't literate in it. There's essentially no, how do you develop a model for it if you've got no data? Or you can go to linguistic transcripts that are done in IPA or some kind of kludgy thing like that. Marshallese. There is a written form of Marshallese used mostly by linguists who study the language, because everybody who's literate in the Marshall Islands essentially goes to the Jesuit high school and they get literate in English. There are very few, just this, and it's no slam against the Marshallese. It's just having worked a little bit with that population years and years ago, the language access approach was very different. And again, if you don't have much data, then how are you going to get the model to function? And then there have been reports in the press of how, for example, if a query, and I forget which of the LLMs, but if you query it in Arabic, it's translated, the query is translated into English and then run in English, and then the result translated back into Arabic. How does that actually, would you get the same kind of answer if you had a panel of experts? Would it be factually, of people from the country, right? Because now you're using English language data to answer a question in Arabic, which might be about something that there's just not much data in English. All of those things, I think there's a lot more research to be done. And then the models themselves face a challenge of data. That this was a paper published by Amazon researchers in one of the computer science conference proceedings, which is where the computer science people do their high quality publishing. That the use of AI generated data for synthetic data for training could potentially cause serious issues with accuracy. And then there are the hallucinations, and there's the story that on Whisper that came out in late October, where it hallucinates a lot, and it might only put 1 or 2 sentences in or phrases.
Say what Whisper is, Bill.
Whisper is it's an OpenAI app that does ambient transcripts. So transcribing this conversation and summarizing and such. So it's similar to the AI companion that a lot of people use in Zoom. And that's a great tool, but if you're using it for a legal proceeding, or if you're using it in a medical setting, you really don't want it inserting stuff that's not there. That could be problematic. And I guess what you're hearing is that I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I'm not anti-technology, but we have to be careful. Yes, there's enormous promise, as Katharine said. And I pointed out one fairly obvious use case in the schools where it's just impossible in the classroom on a day, 180 days a year in school in the U.S. to have language access for all those kids on the day-to-day basis, while they're also there learning English. Would that be used in a disciplinary hearing? I wouldn't recommend that. Would it be used in what we call an IEP, individualized education plan meeting, which is for kids with special needs? Again, wouldn't recommend that either, because there are all sorts of other things going on there. Could you use it in a school board meeting? Maybe, although those can get really contentious, and you probably do need a human interpreter to deal with all the yelling and shouting and cursing.
But in terms of how the task force has identified it, we did get a lot of the first thing we did was run that big perception survey, which CSA Research ran for us. And
tell us about that.
Definitely, you have, if you go in, all these things are available for free, on the website. You can download them. And I really encourage people to go to the website, because between the results of the perception survey, the results of research that were carried out by our deaf and hard of hearing colleagues, who we have a kind of unique collaboration with, and the follow-up study that CSA Research did, partially based on the perception study and their own research, which is a criteria report on speech to speech, you just have some excellent tools for okay, I have these use cases, and then how can I how can I how do I determine my own criteria for decision making? But in the perception survey, you came up with just so much concern from people, specifically around languages of lesser diffusion. Then how is this technology going to safeguard or be accurate? Or if it's not accurate, how do we put in those guardrails? Like, okay, if for these languages, it just doesn't work, and you have to have the human there, right? So in terms of like documenting that concern and very well stated, written examples of it, that's all in the survey, and you can go see it. And then the other thing I would say is that, as Bill said, this is something that everyone's so acutely aware of. And the first strong effort with a language of lesser diffusion, so to speak, that we have had is this collaboration we have with the deaf and hard of hearing community. And out of that has come to another organization. And this is a community that was very in their, on their end, and they'll often say it, just very negatively impacted by not having any say in how VRI rolled out for the deaf and hard of hearing. And that technology can be very limited, and sign language is a 3D communication, and VRI is a 2D communication, and there's huge implications that, as hearing people, we don't even perceive the implications, right? Like we can't perceive that. So that's the community that we've definitely built the strongest collaboration with, and have continued to work towards to make sure that any effort is inclusive of that community and that language. And I think the next steps are, and Bill, if you want to address next steps, right now we're kind of in a moment of trying to put a real legal formal structure to the Safe AI and Interpreting Task Force. And then for me, it's like 100%, you need to have sort of work groups and committees that are just really trying to tackle this language of lesser diffusion issue. And there's a lot of good tackling happening. And the person to really ask is Mila Golovine, who's doing a lot of work around trying to digitize some of the Mayan languages and get databases up online so that you can start to train an AI on it and have it be more. It's not just so you can start to train it, so you can actually have access, but the end result will be better data. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, and the two research projects informed the guidance that was developed, where the principles of communicative autonomy, accountability, transparency, and reduction of harm, and I think I put them out of order. Are I don't want to, I think they should be fairly non-controversial, and really the broader point of making sure that where Safe AI has come down is it fit for purpose? Is it fit for purpose? And we still have a lot of work, I think, as an industry, as a community of practice in interpreting, as researchers, computational linguists, to show fit for purpose. And as Katharine said, I think, and I agree completely, there's going to be some rough waters ahead, because there will be applications where it might not work. There'll be application and we may find surprises where it does work. I also think there will be new use cases. Like, I'm seeing a lot of YouTube in automatically generated captions now in YouTube that they're okay. If you don't know the source
they
language,
expand. You can get a gist of it, right?
You're expanding access. Do you really want to put a kilogram of salt in, or did they mean 10 grams, or something like that? Is it that kind of mistake? And okay, I'm not putting. There was some recipe that my wife was watching on YouTube, and I think it was an Italian was the source language, and yeah, there was some ridiculous, okay, anybody could look at that and say, no, I'm not doing that, right? It was just a glitch, but those new use cases are out there too. And I think where Safe AI goes is forming this organization that can then carry out some independent research, to really try and assess fit for purpose, quality of what's coming out. Because right now it's just a he said, she said, or they say, we say. The AI vendors, AI interpreting vendors saying yes, it's just as good as a human. Not all of them are saying that, and the interpreting community is saying so. No, it's not. And where the truth lies is a little harder to discern.
I mean, if I'd add two things to that. One is that I don't want to end this podcast without sort of calling out all of the other very important ways that AI when you're not talking about the direct speech to speech conversation, is going to come in and really change interpreting it for it in many positive ways. And one of the question marks, so just the same with machine translation, you came up with cat tools, and that technology got embedded throughout this is a highly technologized industry. I think we're going to start seeing that for the interpreting. And just as an interpreter and trainer myself, the level of productivity advancement and ability to hone my skills that these tools give is off the charts already. Like the ability to say, you have an assignment in this school district with this school board meeting with these 10 topics, and to go to AI and like create and, to just extract what I need for that without spending hours and hours sifting through websites and sifting through forms and, creating my own, just painstakingly creating glossaries. And then the ability to have the AI say, make it like you use Google, the notebook. Like now I have a little 15-minute podcast that will take all that and I can practice to it, right? Like the tools are incredible. And one of the biggest, I would put a call to action to our field. It's like right now, the tools that really target interpreting are being created by tech savvy interpreters and these tiny little companies like Simonode and Interprebank and those they're so good. But of course, everyone goes for the Otter AI and just these juggernaut companies that aren't targeting interpreting. And so I really hope to see some of our vendors and our LSPs, take these softwares and do something with them, because they could really support that human in the loop side of it. I think there's a lot of hope and promise and like incredible advancement around the ability to enhance our skill sets, and to use it. So
what you just outlined was fascinating. So you're saying you're taking certain, I don't know, context or glossaries, you put them into Google Notebook, you produce that funny podcast that everybody checked out, and then you're practicing like
it's like this total target practice. Like if I have
awesome.
if I have the board, the board minute notes, and I can feed in, here's the video. The thing about that particular one is I can link it to the recordings of previous board meetings, right? I can give it 100 documents, but I can target it like, and then you like, okay, tell me what is the most common, you can like, you have it parse it down to what they're going to be talking about and how they talk about it. And then you get that 15-minute podcast, and what a perfect way to activate your terminology and practice the specific stuff you need. I mean, like, incredible. It's just like people, this is where I feel, so I just didn't want to end the podcast without sort of saying, I think that for me, the biggest thing that AI brings into the field is this idea of accountability on all levels. So it's accountability for the people developing these softwares. It's the accountability of people applying them. Like, what is the use case? Is it fit for use? And it's also this idea that I personally feel like we just need to ramp up our education of ourselves and our clients to really focus it, to be positively proactive around what is the decision-making criteria that applies to you. Is this a webinar? Is this a Slator con? Is it, it's like, do these tools provide the ability to greatly, increase your access in multiple languages? That's a good fit for use, but good use case. Do you want to use that in the cancer discussion? Maybe not, right? Maybe it's not really fit for use yet with that, one-on-one, really multi-layered human interaction, right? So I just think the accountability piece that Safe AI brings to the table is what I think is most important. And that can be, we all want what we do to be positive. And so, I don't think it needs to be a tug of war. I just think it's like, hey, use this accountably. We need to develop the tools and give people the ability to do it accountably.
Great closer, Bill. Anything to add?
I think we're very early days. This is like 2002 in terms of, when statistical MT first really appeared on the scene. And it'll be several years before we see the kinds of changes that, we can see the seeds of, at least companies that Katharine's talked about. And, to me, the idea of being able to generate that kind of term list, my first assignment was for an X-ray satellite negotiation between NASA and the Soviet Space Institute. That term list took almost a month of development because I had to go find the dictionaries and the scientific papers in Russian and read them and compile terms it was like, to be able, kind of blows my mind that kind of productivity gain that you can make. I mean, that's maybe an extreme example, but the productivity gains you could make using these tools would be, of enormous benefit to interpreters, or having, if you're online. You're in a booth and you can have terms suggested to you, right? Because this happens to everybody. You get stuck on a term and just can't pull it up quickly, and then you got to keep moving. Well, if that's right there, that could be really helpful too. Just examples like that. But I also, want to stress that we're in putting Safe AI together, we deliberately included as many stakeholder categories as we could: regulators, researchers, interpreters, state government people, healthcare, judicial, different state offices of the state administrative offices of the courts that run interpreting programs, and so on, language services companies, trying to get a broad perspective and doing what I think that what we didn't do when VRI really first came out. So there's just a lot of backlash and a lot of fighting about it, but it wasn't realistic. And the VRI answered a tremendous need, and you can take your chair to the edge of the sea and tell a tide not to turn, but it's still going to turn, right? So let's be realistic about the world around us and how this industry is going to change and evolve. But also, as Katharine said, we need to be at the table and really ensuring that in order for things to be fit for purpose, you have to have involvement from the client side, from the people. You have to have involvement from a broader range than just straight up technologists making apps, because some of the things I've seen in terms of the way these apps have been sold are just completely oblivious to the legal requirements that are out there, completely oblivious to the actual communication situation, and then they don't work very well.
All right. We'll hope that the Safe AI, well, we don't hope, it's actually already having an impact. So let me send people with a call to action: safeaitf.org. Go check it out. Tons of information there, great research. And yeah, it was great to have this podcast and contribute a little bit to spreading the word about Safe AI. So Katharine and Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.